Hi there, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to make the Evie Messenger Bag. So let's go ahead and take a look at the bag itself. The outside you can do out of cotton or canvas or even include cork. There's instructions for both. I've done this one with a cork handle and cork bottom, and I will be doing that for today's sample as well. It has a long adjustable strap so you can wear it on your shoulder or crossbody. The large outside flap is actually a pocket as well. It opens up really wide so you can fit all of your essentials in there. You can even fit a small tablet if you need to. Underneath that is another zippered pocket in the front here, nice and roomy for more goodies. You have some outside divided pockets and inside more divided pockets. It's roomy, has lots of storage, and is great for an everyday bag or even a small work bag. So today's video, we're gonna walk step by step through making this bag, and I'm really excited to see how yours come out. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. So let's go through our materials. I already went ahead and got all of my cutting and fusing done, but let's go through all of the pieces that you're going to need. I've chosen to use this canvas for the outside. This is not a super heavy canvas, but it's a nice weight, works really well for bag making. This is a Rifle Paper Company canvas. So I have two rectangles for my A, which is my outside top. Those are already fused with decor bond. I also have here my B. This is going to be for that outside divided pocket. This gets interfacing just on the front half, so the entire piece is not interfaced. That's going to cut down on some of the bulk. Just remember, if you have a directional fabric, which I don't today, to make sure that this is the bottom, because when you fold this over and add it to your bag, this is going to be the outside. It's going to be what faces up. So you want to make sure that you have your directional fabric going the correct way. I have here from cork, I have my C handles. This is going to make the long adjustable handle, so I have two strips here. Remember, if you're making these out of cotton, they're going to be cut a little bit differently and fused. For the cork, I'm not using any interfacing, so just double check your pieces, and as well as step one, you're fusing how you're going to handle cotton versus cork. I have here my D. This is going to be for my flap. So the flap pocket is fully lined, so there's two pieces for the outside. There will also be two for the inside. I have here, again from cork, this is E. If you are using cotton, these would be interfaced. For cork, they do not need to be interfaced, and they're gonna be cut the same size. I have my lining pieces F, and please note, if you have one of the earlier copies of the pattern, there is a typo. Your F fabric is the correct size. Your F interfacing is incorrect. The pattern has been fixed. If you bought it recently or if you're purchasing it now, you will have the correct sizes, but your F fabric is the size of your interfacing. So your interfacing is the entire size of that piece. If you have one of the older patterns, my apologies. Ignore the interfacing size. It is incorrect. It's too small. I have here my G, which is my outside zippered pocket. There's no interfacing for this. So even though this is part of the outside, it is cut from my lining fabric. And as I always do, I fold my pockets zippered and divided in half like this. It just kind of reminds me that they're pockets. I have here my two pieces of H. These are also out of the lining fabric, not interfaced. These are for those inside divided pockets. And lastly, I have I, which is interfaced. These are for the lining of that zippered flap. So let's go over the rest of the items that you will need for your bag, other than your sewing machine with your 1/4 inch, your zipper foot, and also your blind hem. That's what I use to do my 1/8 inch stitching. I also have my matching thread. Since I do have a lighter bottom and a darker top, I'm gonna be kind of changing back and forth depending on what I'm stitching. I have some zipper tape here. This is going to be for the zipper flap as well as the pocket. You're going to need a little bit of extra for that zippered pocket, so if you want to choose two different colors, you can absolutely do that. I've got my poles here as well. I have my slide set, which is just a slide and a rectangle ring. That's how we're going to do the adjustable strap. And I'm adding a handmade tag. I like to add those to all of my bags. I'll show you a good place where you can add that. I have my basic tools. Obviously I have my cutting mat, my rotary cutter, my ruler, all of those items. I also have my 4-in-1 tool. This has a nice turning tool as well as a seam ripper. I have scissors, marking tools, I have my chalk pencil and a regular pen. I go back and forth depending on what I'm marking. I've got clips, always need clips for bag making, and some pins. So let's get started. Step 1 is fusing, which I've already gone ahead and finished. So I'm going to move on to step 2, which is making the handle and tab. So if you are using cotton fabric, you are going to do a few things differently. Your cotton is going to be the first in the instructions. You're still going to need to sew your pieces together. So you'll be sewing your fabric pieces on the short ends, making one nice long strip. When you get that sewn, you're going to press your seam open. And then when you fuse your interfacing, you're just going to fuse the interfacing right on top. Don't worry about where it lands on that seam. If it's like right on the seam or over, it does not matter. And when it comes to the second piece of interfacing, don't butt them up to each other. You will get a permanent crease and a weak spot in your handle. You'll want to overlap them slightly. So you'll just, about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, just overlap your interfacing. And then you're also going to create your tab. Your tab will just have interfacing in the center. So when you're looking at the bag, and again, I'm talking about cotton, but if this was a cotton tab right here, I don't want my interfacing throughout the entire piece because it's going to be really bulky in the seams. So my interfacing would just kind of be in this center area right here. It's just a little bit to add some stability where the hardware goes. But since I'm working with cork today, I'm going to show you how to do that. So I'm going to take these to the sewing machine and stitch these two ends together, 1/4 inch seam. In the pattern, it is going to show you how to press this open, which you absolutely can do. And if you prefer to press your edges inward before top stitching, you would want to press it open. I, however, have updated some things and I like to do it a little bit differently now. So I'm going to sew this and then I'll show you how I like to press this seam and then we'll talk about top stitching. I stitched my 2C pieces at the short ends to make one nice long handle. And here's what I like to do differently from the pattern. So if you want to fold your edges when you're top stitching and you want to fold them in like this so that you have 2 clean edges on either side, you're going to follow the pattern and press this seam open. So you can finger press it or you can iron it and you're going to press it open. That's going to help with this technique. I don't really care if I have one folded edge and one raw edge. I find it a little bit easier and I just do it that way. So in that case, what I like to do is instead of pressing my seam open, I cut in the middle. I just kind of eyeball where the middle is, and I cut as close to that stitching as I can without going through it. Then what I do is when I fold my piece in half, I push one seam to the right and one to the left, and I can fold it in half just like that, and I get this really nice, crisp seam. It's flat, it's really strong, and now it's ready for top stitching. And I'll just add a clip here. You can add clips along these edges if you would prefer. I usually just hold it with my fingers. I would rather not use the clips, but by all means, if you need to use clips, you can do so. So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine, and I like to do a double top stitch. I like to do 1/8 and 1/4 from each side. Whatever you want to do, it's totally up to you. That's just what I like to do. And here's a tip for you. I've done a couple of videos and I've talked about this a lot. This is my G foot, which is for my Janome. This is a blind hem foot, and you can see there is a guide in the middle. So what I do is I move my needle all the way to the left, and when I take this over to the machine, and it's folded in half, I can run that guide right along the edge, and I get a beautiful 1/8 inch top stitching. I can do that and then use my 1/4 inch foot to do a 1/4 on each side, and I'm all set. So I'm gonna go top stitch, and then I'll be back to talk about adding hardware. So I've gone ahead and done my top stitching. I did 1/8 and 1/4 on either side, and I trimmed off a piece for my tab. So instead of sewing this, I actually decided that I want to add some rivets to my pieces. So I've grabbed a pack of rivets here. I'm just gonna put some out on the table. I'll show you where you would sew yours, but I've decided that I'm gonna add the rivets for today, and just put my rivet press together. Why not add rivets when you can, right? Okay, so my press is all set, and let me show you what you're gonna do on your handle, and then I'm gonna replicate the same thing but with rivets. So for your tab, you're going to be adding your rectangle ring, and all you're gonna do is just loop your piece right through and fold that over. You don't wanna fold this completely in half, so I don't want these ends together. It's gonna be really bulky in my seams. So what I'm gonna do is just fold this probably about 2/3 of the way. If you are using cotton, you are going to do it a little bit differently. You will be folding those edges because you'll need to hide both of those raw edges, but that's why we shorted the interfacing and only put interfacing up on the top. But for cork, to eliminate some of the bulk, I'm gonna fold it like this. And what I would do is take it to my machine, stitch across here a few times, and then also as close as I can to the hardware. But for today, what I'm gonna do is take my rivets. So I'm just gonna use my little ProMaster here. And I am not marking this, so we're gonna see if I get it nice and even. This is always a crapshoot with me because I don't mark things. So you should probably mark. I'm just gonna put 2 holes in. I'm gonna do 2 side by side. And I'm trying not to go through the top stitching because I don't want it to rip. That's pretty even. All right, so I'm gonna take my rivet and I just put the post through and pop the cap on. There we go. And put one, actually I'll do this one first. So I have my Gold Star press and I have my bottom piece already set in and the top piece for the rivet. So all I'm gonna do is place that, give that a good crunch. And number 2, put that right next to it. Go. I love that pop. And I think I put them a little bit too close together, but that's okay. So you should probably space yours out a little bit more, but that's all right. I'm happy with that. I didn't go too far down because I didn't want this to move. I hate when the rectangle ring has too much room and it moves. That's why I usually sew in 2 spots. You can sew and add rivets if you want to just do those as decoration, totally up to you. But I'm happy, so that's all set. And now I'm going to do my handle. So what you're gonna do on your handle is take one of your ends and you're going to loop it up and over the center bar of your slide. So you're just gonna go up and over like that. And I pull it down about 1 inch or so. Take this to the machine, stitch back and forth a few times right here, or add a rivet. I'm just gonna add 1 rivet, I think, on here, because this one's actually going to be covered up. So I'm just going to do 1 for now. I'm just kind of winging it, so we'll see how it goes. I might not love this when it's done, but that's okay. There we go. Get that in there. My slide's in the way. There we go. Okay. All right, so now that's done. It's either sewn or riveted. If you are using cotton, instead of just folding this over once, you're actually going to take your end, fold it once to hide the raw edges, and then fold it again, and then that's where you would stitch. That's going to cover up any of your raw edges. For cork, it doesn't matter since it doesn't fray. So I'm gonna take my handle here, making sure that it is not twisted. I don't want that twisted at all. I'm gonna take my tab, put that on and just let it stay loose. Bring this up and back over that center bar, just like that. And now I have my adjustable handle. So I can only see these 2 rivets. That's why I just did 1 here. I feel like it's strong enough. If you want to put 2 here as well, that's totally fine. And I'm all set. So these 2 ends will get sewn into the bag later, so I don't have to worry about those. I can set this aside and get ready for my next step. For step 4, I'm going to prepare my B, which is my outside pocket. I'll show you on here. And this is the pocket right here that we're preparing, this open one in front of the zipper. So the first thing I'm going to do is fold this right sides together. And remember, your pocket is taller than it is wide. So there is my uninterfaced piece, and there's the piece that has interfacing. I just have interfacing on the front half. This is the half that will face towards me, away from the bag. So I'm just gonna use a couple clips to hold my edges together. You can take this to the ironing board if you want. Sometimes this center fold doesn't quite want to line up because the interfacing is, you know, doing its job and kind of pushing, but you can take it to the ironing board and press that if you want. What I'm going to do now is take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew with the interface piece on top. That's going to keep it from stretching. I'm gonna sew 1/4 inch on both of these short sides. I'm leaving the bottom open. That's gonna go in a seam, and this is folded so I don't have to worry about the top edge. So I'm gonna sew 1/4 inch on both sides, making sure to backstitch. My B front pocket is all stitched. I stitched the short ends 1/4 inch, made sure to backstitch, and now I'm gonna turn it right side out. If you want, you can do a little snip in the corner here to help those sit a little bit better. Not a big deal, but I do that when I remember. So I'm just gonna turn this, and this is where I like to use my turning tool. Make sure I get a nice crisp corner. And just get right in there and poke those corners out. There we go. I'm gonna take this over to the iron and give it a really good press, and then I'm going to top stitch just this top edge, just the folded edge. Down here, it's still open. This bottom edge is gonna go into a seam, and I'm going to sew the sides in a later step so I don't have to do anything with those. So I'll just press and top stitch across here. My B is all set. I gave it a good press and top stitched this top folded edge. I did not change my thread color out. I decided to keep the contrasting color. I like how it looks, so I'll see how I feel as the bag goes on. Sometimes contrasting thread is good, and sometimes if you're not having a great sewing day, it's not the best choice. So far, I'm happy. And I just top stitched 1/4 inch. You can do 1/4, 1/8, whatever you would like. So for step 5, we're going to finish the bag front. So you're gonna grab one of your A's. And again, if you have directional fabric, make sure that your top is facing up. So we don't want anything upside down. And this piece right here, the B, is gonna go right on top. So I'm gonna find my centers down at the bottom here to make sure that it's perfectly lined up. And all I'm gonna do is just fold that in half, add a pin. Just easy peasy. And fold this one. Right, and now I know that they are perfectly lined up. So my raw edge of my pocket is down towards the bottom. I'm gonna add a couple of clips here. You can pin this as well. I'll probably add a pin to the top up here. And now I'm gonna take this to my sewing machine, and I'm gonna stitch in a couple of places. I wanna stitch the sides here. I'm gonna do 1/8 inch. I'm also gonna stitch the bottom at 1/8 inch, that way nothing shifts on me. And then I'm gonna make a light mark with my chalk pencil and just sew the center. And when I sew my center seam to make it nice and strong, I like to start at the bottom, work my way up, turn, and come back down. So I'm gonna go stitch that, and then we'll be ready to add the bottom. I stitched my pocket in place on my front piece. So I used my blind hem foot, and I just did 1/8 inch. I started here, went across the bottom, and back up to the top. I measured and marked the center and did my stitching. Again, I like to start at the bottom, stitch up to the top, turn, and come back down. So now I have 2 pockets. It's secured down on the bottom. That'll make the next step a little bit easier. So to finish up step 5, you're going to grab your bottom piece, and you're going to place it right sides together, just like this. So 1/4 inch, and then give it a good press. Because I'm using cork, the cork kind of likes to go upward in the seam, and the pocket being thick wants to go downward. So I just kind of let it decide on its own which way it wants to go. It's not super imperative that it goes in any certain direction. Once I have that pressed as best as I can, I will top stitch. I only like to top stitch on the cork part. I'll show you on the finished bag. So I just like to do my top stitching down here. I don't like to top stitch over the pocket. It's not gonna hurt anything, it's just a personal preference. If you wanna top stitch on both sides, you absolutely can, that is fine. So since I'm going to the machine with that, I'm also going to take my other A piece and my other C piece, do the same thing, place them right sides together, sew 1/4 inch seam, and press and top stitch. Again, remember, if you have directional fabric, make sure this is the top, and you put this on the bottom. So I'm gonna place this right here. I'll add a few clips, take this over to the machine, and then I will get my stitching done. I stitched my bottom C pieces onto the top A pieces. I went ahead and pressed them as best as I could, and I top stitched. So as far as the pressing is concerned, on the back I pressed my cork seam, the bottom seam up, and on the front I pressed the seam down. And the reason for that is when we get to the final steps where we start sewing the bag together, those seams will nest really nicely and make that go together a little bit easier. I top stitched 1/4 of an inch from this seam just on the cork. You can top stitch on both sides. You can change it up, do 1/8, 1/4, both, whichever you would like. So now that I have that done, I'm going to go ahead and add my handmade tag before I go any further so that I don't forget. And I'm going to put that right on the front here. So I think I'm just going to put it right here on the pocket. It's going to just catch the bottom of that pocket and just, I'm going to lose like maybe 1/2 inch, but that's okay. I like how that looks. I could put it on the cork, but I think I like it on the pocket. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball that and use my chalk pencil. I put them on the flap, I put them on the bag. It's really up to you if you want to add a handmade tag where you would like to add it. So I'm just going to take my seam ripper and poke through, and I'm going through all the layers. It's very thick. There we go. Okay, it's a lot of layers there. Okay, so I'm going to take my handmade tag, put that right through there, and take my washer. There's plenty of layers here, so I'm not really concerned with adding anything extra. Plus the handmade tags are not weight bearing, so I'm not really concerned. And I'm just gonna push those over on top of each other. And there, I'm done. Okay, so now that that's done, now it's time to add the outside zippered pocket. For step 6, we're going to add the outside zippered pocket. So I have my front, which has my open pocket here. I have my zipper and zipper pull, and I have my G piece for my zippered pocket. So first things first, let me show you how to add a zipper pull on if you're using the zipper tape. It's actually not that hard to do. I've done a few videos on it, but I thought I would include it in today's video as well. So I have my zipper cut to the length I need, and I've opened it up a little bit on one end. And I want to work on this side of the zipper pull, the side that has that divider in the center. And I'm just going to put my teeth and tape in a little bit on each side. Sometimes you'll feel or hear them click together, sometimes you don't, it's not a big deal. And then I put it on a hard surface, put my fingers on either side of the tape, and I kind of wiggle and pull. And just like that, it's on. So my zipper is pretty even down here, so I can just leave it, or if I want, if this is uneven, I can open up this end and trim it however I like. So I have my zipper ready. I'm just gonna set that aside for now. And on the back here, I've gone ahead as per the pattern and I've drawn my lines. I did forget to draw my little V's, so let me do that. If you've done any of my patterns that have zippered pockets before, this is gonna look very familiar to you. I also have a full YouTube video on this if you want to watch a really in-depth video on how to put this in. I'm gonna walk you through the pattern, but I'm not gonna get into all of the little details. So what you're gonna do first is find your center, draw your box, and you're going to take your G piece and you're just gonna place that right side up on your surface, and then you're gonna place your pocket or your outside right side down. Now you can find the centers of both of these if you want to make sure that they're perfectly lined up. I usually just eyeball it, make sure that I have enough on each side so I have my seam allowance. And as far as where this is placed, it does not matter. If you want to line it up or if you want to pull it down, it doesn't make any difference. So don't stress about where that piece is. That becomes the bottom seam of the pocket when we're done, and it's not going to make a big difference. So I'm just going to put this right there. It looks pretty centered. I'm going to use some pins. You always want to pin this pocket because when you take this to the sewing machine, you don't want your pocket to shift and flip up. And I'm just going to put a pin right here. That way it's not going through the cork and it's not in my way when I'm sewing. So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch around the outside of the box. ignoring the lines that are too long, ignoring the center line and the V's. Just stitch all the way around here. I'll bring it back and show you how to cut and prepare it for your zipper. My pocket is all sewn. I stitched all the way around the outside, and I cut on the center line with my scissors. You can use a rotary cutter, a ruler, whatever is easier for you. So I just cut all the way across right to the point of the V's that I drew. And now, I'm gonna try to bring this in nice and close for you. I wanna cut right back into that corner as close as I can get to where I stitched. At this point, if your stitching is not perfect on the pen marks that you made, don't worry about the pen marks, worry about where your stitching is. So I'm trying to get my scissors as close to without cutting through as I can. And I'm gonna do this one perfect. And on this side, I'm not gonna cut all the way through because I want you to see what it will look like and how to fix it if you don't cut close enough. So on this one, I'm not gonna cut all the way into the corner. And I'll show you what happens when you do that. So my left side is perfect, my right side is not. So I'm gonna pull my pocket through to the back. I took my pins out. And I need to take this to the ironing board and press this really well. So I wanna fold this back on the seam and give it a really good press. I work on, one side, work on the other side, and then I do the short sides. So you'll see on this side, when I press this, even just lightly with my fingers, it's super flat. It looks really great. But on this side, no matter what I do, no matter how much I pull, I have these big creases and puckers in the corner. That is what happens when you don't cut all the way into the corner. So what I'm gonna do to remedy that, it feels like it's not that big of a deal, but it makes a huge difference. I'm gonna take my scissors and get right back in there and cut a couple more threads to get right into that corner, right where I stitched. And now, when I do that, it's flat. So I'm gonna take this to the ironing board. I'm gonna give this a really good press, and I'll be back to show you how to add your zipper. I forgot to mention earlier that I'm gonna be using this fusible tape, so I'll show you how I use this instead of pins to hold my zipper in place. So I took my piece over to the ironing board and I gave it a really good press, and I just wanna go over a couple of things with the pocket before we add our zipper. So because my pocket fabric and my outside are cut the way the pattern says, and they are two different fabrics, I have this little edge right here that you might see around the pocket itself. That is because this is not pulled as tight. My seam is not folded as tight as it could be. So it gives this little rim, which kind of looks like piping, and I like it. I'm happy with how that looks. If you don't like it, there's two ways that you can fix that. Number one, you can keep fussing and rolling that seam back, making sure that none of that pocket is showing. Or you can use the same fabric for the outside and this pocket. It doesn't have to be the same as the lining itself, but you could cut an extra square from this fabric and that would hide that. So if any of that showed, it would be the same fabric. But I kind of like it. I think it looks intentional and it looks kind of fancy, so I'm gonna leave it. So I went ahead and pressed from the front and the back, and I added my pins back in. And on the back side here, I took some of my 1/4 inch wide fusible tape and I just added a piece on each of the long sides. I butted it right up against the opening. I don't do anything on the short ends. I don't find that it really helps me. So what I'm gonna do is take my paper off, and if you have any problems getting your paper off, sometimes you just need to warm it up with the iron again. And if you are using a fabric on the front that you cannot iron on, if you're using like a vinyl or something else, you can use 1/4 inch wide non-fusible tape. It will work just the same for this. But because I have cotton, I'm using a fusible tape. So what I'm gonna do is take this to my ironing board, and I'm gonna place my zipper right side up on my ironing surface. I'm gonna take my bag right side down, or excuse me, also right side up. I don't know why I said that. And I'm just going to work my zipper, making sure it's nice and straight, just like that. And once I'm happy with it, I will press that in place. Using the tape replaces pins, because trying to get a pin through a zipper and keep it straight never works for me. So I'm going to fuse this down. Once it's in place, I'm going to stitch around the zipper about 1/8 to 1/16 of an inch. I stitched my zipper in place. I used my zipper foot and went about 1/8 of an inch all the way around. So now I'm gonna take out my pins, and to finish up the pocket, to close it up, you're gonna turn your piece over. First things first, stitch or snip off the excess zipper. You don't want to get that caught in your seam allowance, so we can just cut that right off. And I'll cut down here as well. And now you're going to bring your top to your bottom. So you're going to bring these edges together and stitch across here 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to clip these together just to show you how this is going to look. And then what you're going to do is pull your pocket down towards the bottom of the bag. You want your pocket hanging where it would naturally hang in the bag. You don't want to pull it up and sew it. And then you're just going to close up these sides. So you don't want to sew it to your lining. You just want to fold your lining back, stitch 1/4 inch here and 1/4 inch here. It does not matter where this seam goes. So if your seam is higher than mine or lower, it does not make any difference. My zippered pocket is closed. I pulled the bottom and top seam together, sewed 1/4 inch, pulled it down so it's hanging towards the bottom of the bag. That's going to be important for a nice flat pocket. You don't want it to be up towards the top. So I pulled that down towards the bottom, stitched my sides, and these are not sewn to the bag itself, so I just fold the lining out of the way. Stitch those 1/4 inch. I did not press anything. You can absolutely press. I just push this seam down with my fingers when I'm sewing, but if you want to take it to the ironing board, you absolutely can. And now I have a closed pocket that's ready for me to put things into. So now I'm ready to move on to step 7 and trim with my templates. I've gone ahead and cut the templates from the back of my pattern. I always suggest that you make a copy of them and leave the originals in the pattern. That way you don't ever have to worry about losing them. I just have mine out of paper, but you can use cardstock or template plastic, whatever you would prefer. So for template 1, which is going to have the curve with this little bit of a triangle cutout, that is going to be for your 2 outside pieces, the ones that we just worked on, as well as your F, which are your lining pieces. And for template 2, that is going to be for the flap. So that's going to be for the 2 D pieces of outside fabric and the I pieces of the lining fabric. So as far as your cutting is concerned, you can just cut one and use it as a template to cut the rest. Sometimes I do that. You can go ahead and mark with a pen or pencil. You can use your rotary cutter, whatever is the most comfortable for you. So for template 1, you're going to line this up on your bottom corners. So you're going to have one over here. Let me move this over. And then you're going to take this and flip it over and do that on the other side. So both of your outside pieces, you'll be cutting from the bottom, which for me is the cork. For the lining pieces, just make sure that your lining pieces, if they are directional, that your top is up here, this is cut from your bottom corners, and that your pieces are wider than they are tall. You don't want to cut them the opposite way. And then for your flap pieces, the same thing, they should be wider than they are tall, and make sure that you are cutting from the bottom corners right down here. So if you have a directional fabric, make sure that is the top. So for this one, we don't have the triangle, we just have a curve. So you're just gonna cut this curve, flip that over, and cut that curve. And again, what I normally do is I will cut one of these and then use that as my template to cut the other pieces. So I'm gonna go ahead and do my trimming, and I'll be right back. For step 8, we're going to prepare the zippered flap. So I have here my zipper, my 2 pulls, I have my outside D pieces as well as my lining I pieces. I also have a chalk pencil, I have my pins and clips. So first things first, I'm going to show you how to add your pulls on to make a double zipper pull, and then I'll show you how to put this together. So let me slide those out of the way. So first thing you're going to do, just like you did before, is open up one of your ends, and again, you're going to be working on the side that has that little divider in the center. And we're going to get this on. Your first pull really doesn't matter if it's like off a little bit, and I'll show you what I mean. So I put that on, and I have a little bit of a bubble, but I have to open this end anyway. So for my second pull, this can always be a little bit of a challenge, especially once you master putting on one pull. Now you have something new to learn, but it's not that bad. So when you look at your zipper, mine is a little bit longer on this side. So I can do one of 2 things. I can either trim this even, which I probably will do because it's kind of frayed, or I can put this end in a little bit further. But what I'm gonna do is just hold these ends together and trim them. Having all these little frays makes a huge difference in getting your pull on, and it can make it a little bit harder for you. So now I have 2 nice clean ends, and what I'm gonna do is again put my pull on, And this time I'm gonna be extra careful to try to get this lined up and as even as possible. And what I do before I put my pull on, I can see that I have a bubble here. So I kind of hold that together. I can see that that's not gonna be super even. So I'm gonna pull this out and just keep fussing with it until you get it as perfect as you can. So when I look at that, I think that looks pretty good. I'm gonna put it on and see. Oh, I have a bubble. So that right there, that's what I don't want. I'm gonna try this one more time. And actually what I think I'm gonna do, and you can do this too, is I'm gonna take off a little bit. So I know that one side is longer than the other. So I'm gonna put this side in first, a little bit further. Put this side in. And that looks pretty good. And there we go, perfect. So you're going to take a little bit of time, kind of fuss with this. Don't give up. Putting zipper pulls on did not come naturally for me. I can assure you it took me a while to get really comfortable with it. So don't worry. There's lots of videos out there with different techniques using forks and all sorts of other things. I just find that this is the technique that works for me, but you find what works for you. And if you're having that hard of a time and it's just not working, you can absolutely make this flap with just one pull. I just like having a double pull. So now that I have that on, I'm gonna move my pulls towards the center just so they don't come off. And you can go ahead and stitch across these ends to close that up. I will do that in just a second, but I'm also going to find the center of my tape. So this zipper is much longer than I need it, but I wanna know where the center is, and that's going to help me make sure that I don't have any issues in the construction part, and I don't have my zipper kind of crooked on my bag, and I'm not, short on one side. So before I get ready to pin this on, I'm gonna take this to my machine and I'm gonna sew these ends closed. I just increase my stitch length as far as it will go, which for me is a 5. And I go back and forth over this end several times just to make a stopper. So I'll be right back. My zipper pulls are on. I took this over to the machine and I stitched the ends just to make sure that I don't lose any of my pulls while I'm working on this. I do like to work with my pulls open, and I'll show you how I do that in just a second. If you don't stitch across this, at least put a clip or a pin, something there so that you don't lose your pulls. So I have my center marks on either side of my zipper tape, and I also marked my first piece here, my outside piece. So this is one of my D's, and I just put a little chalk mark within the seam allowance down here at the bottom. So what I'm gonna do is open up my zipper and move my pulls right down to the ends. And I'm going to take and put my zipper right sides together with this piece. I'm doing half at a time. So I'm gonna line up this center mark with the center of my bag, and I use a combination of pins and clips. I use clips on the straight edges and I use pins on the curves. So I'm just gonna add a few clips. So I'm lining up the edge of the zipper tape with the center mark here, and I'm lining the edge up along the side of my flap. So now I'm just gonna work on one curve at a time, and I'm just working on this half of the zipper. So what I'm gonna do here is add some pins, right, like this. Now, if you are having a hard time getting this to curve around, you can do as the pattern shows, and you can make some little snips. So what I mean by that is take your scissors, don't cut through your fabric, you're only cutting through the zipper tape, and make sure that they are not more than 1/4 of an inch deep. Do like 1/8 of an inch, and you're just gonna make some little snips like this. And that's going to help this zipper tape to spread out and curve a little bit better. I do this whenever I have a curved zipper. As long as you're making small snips, you don't want them to be too deep. If they're into or out of the seam allowance, if they're more than 1/4 of an inch, you're going to have tears in your zipper, and your zipper could actually weaken and fall apart while you're using your bag, and we don't want that. So little snips, 1/8 of an inch, and just kind of grabbing a little bit at a time. I take my time. I don't care how many pins it takes to get around that curve. Once I get to the straight edge, I'll just use my clips. Second curve is done, and I'm just going to add some clips and come right up this side, just like that. So this is how it looks now. This is the other half of my zipper tape that I just want to push out of the way. My zipper pulls are down at the end here. They're anchored in place because I have stitched. So what I'm going to do before I add my lining piece, I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm just going to baste 1/8 of an inch around here. What that's going to do is make adding the lining piece much easier. It'll make it a lot quicker and it will make my curves smoother. So I'm just going to stitch, I'm just kind of basting it in place about 1/8 of an inch, and then I'll be ready to add the lining. I basted around my zipper about 1/8 of an inch. I increased my stitch length and I used my blind hem foot. So now that I have that in place, now I'm going to take one of the lining pieces and place it right side down. And because I've already basted my zipper and I know that it's not going to shift, I'm just going to use a few clips. I don't find that I need too many, just a couple here and there to hold this in place. And now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and sew 1/4 of an inch. The only thing that I'm going to be careful of and that I go kind of slow with is around this curve. I just want to make sure that my zipper doesn't fold and get caught like that. I want to make sure that the zipper stays nice and straight. So if you want to add a few extra clips, what I usually do is as I get to that curve, I use my fingernail to kind of push the zipper teeth inward to make sure that I'm not catching those. If for some reason you do, you don't have to redo the entire zipper. You can just go back in, take out whatever stitches are not working for you, wherever you caught your zipper, and just redo that little bit. So don't feel like you have to keep redoing the entire thing. And again, curved zippers are not hard, but they take a little bit of practice. They're different than straight zippers. So I'm just gonna add one more clip here. And I'm gonna be using my fingernail to really push that zipper out of the way. It does not matter what piece is on top when I'm sewing, it doesn't make any difference. So I'm gonna make sure I backstitch when I start and stop and sew 1/4 of an inch all the way around here. My lining piece is stitched in place. I did 1/4 of an inch, making sure to backstitch. So now I'm gonna turn this right side out. Another thing that I do like to do is just take a little bit from the curve, just trim a little. I'm not even going a full 1/8 of an inch, I'm just trimming just a tiny bit down. I just find a little bit less bulk helps to make that a little bit smoother when I turn it. I'm gonna grab my turning tool and go ahead and turn this right side out, hoping that everything turned out okay. I felt it, it felt like it was good. So let's check these curves. Take my turning tool and just run that around the edge. There we go. All right, so far so good. I don't see any puckers. I didn't get any pleats on my zipper, so I'm good to go. So I can press and top stitch this right now, but what I'm actually gonna do is wait and do that when the other half is complete. So I'm going to repeat those steps with the other outside and lining piece. So I'm not gonna show you the entire step again, but I'll give you a few tips to make sure that everything lines up. What I like to do to line up my next piece is to close my zipper just a little bit. This is going to help me make sure that I know where to line everything up and so that I don't get any twists. You can usually fix it by taking your zipper pulls off, but I don't know about you, I don't usually want to do that after I've taken time to get them on. So I have the center mark on this half of the zipper and I have the center mark on my outside. So I need to start there. So I'm just going to turn this. And again, right sides together. So I'm just going to line up those marks and I put a clip there. Now, before I do the curves or do anything else, I'm going to pull this over to this side of the zipper and just put a clip over here. I'm just putting it on the very edge. And I'm going to do the same thing here. My tops are lined up. So I'm just pulling that over to the other side. And now that I have that in place, I can very carefully reach in here and unzip my zipper. This is just a little extra bonus. It's kind of hard to explain that in the pattern. So now you can see it in person. It makes a little bit more sense. So now that I have that done, I'm just going to move that half out of the way. That's the half I already sewed. And this is the half that I now need to clip and pin. And I know where everything needs to line up. So I'm just going to do the same thing I did before using pins down at the corner, making my little clips where I need to. And once I get this pinned in place, I'm gonna take this over to the sewing machine. I'm gonna base this half 1/8 of an inch, just like I did the first time. Then I'm going to take my second lining piece, put that right side down, sew a full 1/4 of an inch, and then I'll turn that right side out and I'll come back and show you how to finish this up. I stitched my pieces in place. I basted my outside first, and then I placed my lining piece right sides together, stitched a 1/4 of an inch. So now I'm going to turn this half right side out. And again, I like to use my turning tool down here on the corners. Just find that it gives me a little bit smoother curve. That corner looks good. Let's see. Awesome. All right, so no puckers, no pleats, everything looks good. So at this point, if you want to double check your zipper just to make sure that everything is lined up, you're going to zip your pieces together, and sometimes the zipper gets flipped around, and that is totally fine. So I'm going to zip that and zip that, and it's perfect. I don't have any twists. I didn't do anything incorrectly with my zipper. If for some reason you have, it is not too late to fix it. You may just have to take off your pull, but if you use the tips that I just showed you to line up your pieces, you should be perfect just like I am. So I'm just going to unzip and take this over to the ironing board, and I'm going to press both sides really well from the outside and the lining, and then I'm going to top stitch. I just top stitch from this seam. You can do either 1/8 or 1/4 or both, whatever you would like to do. One final thing before we close up the top edges, if you would like to add a handmade tag on your flap, like I have on this one right here, you can see I have my tag here. What I don't want is to put that through and have my wrong side where the washer is showing on the lining. So before I close this up, before this edge is closed, this is a great part to put your handmade tag in. So you can just reach your hand in here, put your tag through just one of the outside pieces, and then you can hide that washer. So I'm gonna give this a good press, top stitch it, and then when I'm done top stitching, I'm gonna close my zippers up, make sure that they are within the flap. I'm going to trim this edge even. If anything has shifted, I can trim that and trim off the edges of my zipper. And then I'm just going to sew about 1/8 of an inch across here. Just keeping those edges together, it's going to make the finishing steps easier. And don't worry about which way your zippers go. It's going to be hidden in the seam and it won't matter. So if your zippers face out or they face the opposite way, it does not matter. I've completed steps 8 and 9. 9 was just closing up the top edge right here. And for 8, I did top stitch both of my halves separately. So I top stitch them with the zippers open. And then I close up my zippers. You want to make sure that your pulls are within the pocket. You don't want them hanging off the edge. I trimmed off my zipper ends and I straightened up this edge right here. I had shifted just a little bit when I was sewing one of my lining pieces, so I just straightened that up. Taking a little bit off is not going to hurt anything. And when I stitched across here, you can see that this zipper pull, or the tape, excuse me, on the left is kind of sticking out, where the teeth on this side are tucked under a little bit. It does not matter. Sometimes they go in the same direction and sometimes they don't. Just make sure that it's flat. You don't want to be trying to sew over something that's too thick for your sewing machine and end up breaking a needle or damaging your machine. So I just stitched about 1/8 of an inch. Keeping those edges together is going to make the finishing steps a little bit easier. So now that I'm done with that, I'm going to move on to the divided pockets, which are H, and I'm going to prepare both of them the same way. So what I've done here is I folded one of my pockets right sides together to make a tube. You're not going to sew the ends right here. You're just going to stitch right along this long edge, 1/4 of an inch. Make sure that you backstitch. Remember, your pocket is wider than it is high. So I have this nice long tube right here. Once I have that complete, I'm going to take it to the ironing board and press my seam open. I find that this helps to keep everything nice and smooth and it lays flatter. Once I have that done, and I'm going to do the same thing on both pockets, I'm going to turn this right side out. Just like that. And take it back over to the ironing board and give it a final press before I top stitch. So I do not have a directional fabric, so I'm not concerned with that. If you have a directional fabric, you're going to kind of work this on the front side, which is the side without the seam, so that you get it looking the way that you want and you have all of your things upright. You don't want anything upside down. And on the back here, instead of trying to line up this seam right along the bottom, I roll it up a little bit. So mine is not quite at the bottom. It's going to be on the back when it's finished, so it really doesn't make a difference. I'm going to do the same thing with this pocket, and I'm going to top stitch this top edge, the edge that's further from that seam. Just top stitch 1/4 inch, and then these will be ready to add into my line. My pockets are all stitched. The front side is the side without the seam. The back has the seam kind of rolled up from the bottom. It doesn't even matter if they're even. This one, the seam is up a little bit higher than on this one. I just like to not have it right at the bottom because I feel like it adds a little bit of bulk. And sometimes if I didn't cut perfectly or sew perfectly, that seam isn't 100% straight either. So once I have those pressed and top stitched, now I'm ready to add them into my lining. I used my ruler and the measurement provided in the pattern to place one pocket on each of my lining pieces. So this is my H pocket and my F lining. We already trimmed the corners earlier, so you're placing it from the top down. And I like to use my ruler to keep it straight. So once I have it in place, I added some pins, and I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and sew in a few places. First, I'm going to sew across the bottom. And because this pocket does not have any interfacing, sometimes it will shift a little bit. So that's why I like to do the bottom edge first. Then I can take it to the ironing board, press out any creases that I have, straighten it out. Once I have that done, I will trim my edges even. They're a little bit off from the sides of the lining, which is fine. Once I trim those even, I will sew them about 1/8 inch. That is going to help prevent this pocket from flipping over and not getting caught in the seam when we finish up the bag. Once I have that done, I'm going to divide it however I like. I usually just divide down the center because this is a sample. I'm not using this bag, but you can divide it however you want. If you want to put your cell phone or make a skinny pen pocket, whatever you would like, and you can do both halves differently. You don't have to do them both the same. For me, I'm just going to sew the center. So what I do is I either fold it or measure to find my center, draw a light line, and I start at the bottom, stitch up to the top, turn, and come back down. And I don't mark that out right now. I wait just in case this shifts a little bit, so I don't like to do any of my markings yet. So again, I'm going to sew across the bottom. You can do 1/8 or 1/4. Trim up the edges after you press. Do 1/8 inch on your sides, less than your seam allowance. Mark and any pockets that you would like on both halves. Start at the bottom, stitch up, turn, and come back down. My seam is right here. It's facing the lining. My top stitched edge is up here. So I'm going to go ahead and complete both of my linings. My pockets are stitched in place. I stitched along the bottom, trimmed and stitched the edges 1/8 inch, and then I just divided in the center. So I have 2 pockets on each side. Again, you can make as many pockets as you would like, and you can make both of your sides different. I start at the bottom, I stitch up to the top, turn, and come back down, and that makes my pockets nice and strong. So now that I have all of my pieces together, the last thing I'm going to do before I start assembling is to complete the darts. So you have 2 lining pieces and 2 outsides, and you're going to do the same thing for both of them. You're going to fold it right sides together in that little triangle that you cut down at the bottom, and add a pin or a clip. Do the same thing over here. Just fold that right sides together, add a clip, and take this to the sewing machine and sew 1/4 inch. Now when you sew your darts, you're going to be stitching up towards the point of the triangle that you cut, and mine is a little bit uneven, so I may have not done the best job cutting, but that's okay. I'm just going to trim that little bit right there. No big deal. So once I have that done and I stitch it, my stitching is going to go past that point. It's going to start here and come up past that, and I'll show you when I'm done. It's not incorrect. Remember, you're sewing 1/4 inch from where you cut. So I'm going to go sew all 8 darts, my 2 lining pieces and my 2 outside pieces. I've completed all 8 darts. I have my 2 outside and my 2 lining pieces done, and I'm going to show you here on this one. When you fold it right sides together and you do your stitching, this is the open side right here, and I stitched 1/4 inch, so you can see this is the point and this is where my stitching stops. So your stitching is going to extend past the dart, And the point of the darts is to add some dimension and some structure to our bag. So when we look at the finished bag here, you can see that we actually have a little bit of depth to the bottom. It makes a slightly rounded shape to it, but it also helps it to stand up. They don't always stand up on their own until there's things inside, but this gives it a little bit of room so that when we open up the bag, there's plenty of places to put our things. If we kept the bag completely flat, it wouldn't have that ability to it. I did not want to do box corners on this bag because I wanted to give it a little bit different shape. So this is just how we're adding some dimension and shape to this bag. So now that all the pieces are done, I have my flap complete, I have the 2 outsides and the 2 linings. Now it's time to start assembling the bag. So the first thing that you're going to need is your flap and the back outside. I'm gonna move the rest of these out of the way. And I do not have a front to my flap. If you have a certain fabric or design that you have fussy cut maybe and you want to show on the front, or if I had put a handmade tag on the front, I would definitely be paying attention to that right now. Since I don't, I'm not concerned. But let's just say that this is my front. This one right here, I'm putting my front on the back. So those are gonna be right sides together. And this may seem counterintuitive. Why would I put my flap on the back? It's because the flap comes from the back around to the front. So I'm going to put this, I'm not measuring or finding centers, I'm just kind of eyeballing it. And I'm just gonna add a couple of clips, and then I can take this over to the machine and I'm just gonna stitch about 1/8 of an inch. I don't want to do a full quarter because I don't want that stitching to be seen. So I'm just gonna stitch across here 1/8 of an inch and then I'll be ready to finish up. My flap is now basted in place. Just gonna trim my threads here. So the flap is basted right along the top edge, about 1/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to take my front piece, this one right here, and place this right sides together. And I'm going to sew around the outside. And the first thing I like to do is line up my darts. So I'm just pushing these seams, which I have not pressed yet, in the opposite direction of each other. I'm gonna come over here and do the same thing on this side. Just push those so they nest together nicely. And then I'm gonna line up the seam right here. So I want to align that. And earlier I had pressed the back up and the front down. So those nest together really nicely. I'll add a clip here while I'm going. And I'm gonna come over here and do the same thing with that side seam. Line up the things that matter first and then line up the rest of it. So I'll line up this top edge right here. And add a couple more clips down the side. All right, once I have this ready, I'm going to stitch all the way around the sides and the bottom using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Often I will do that twice because this is the main part of the bag and I want to make sure that I catch everything and it looks perfect. So I'm just going to start at one side, back stitch, stitch all the way to the other side and back stitch. I stitched around the outside of my bag. I went around twice just to make sure that I caught everything and to fix any spots that weren't perfect. So now I'm going to turn this right side out. Just take your time, kind of roll it. You can pull the flap out of the way if you need to. And at this point, I'm not going to press anything. I will give it a final press when I'm done, but I don't think that I really need to press now since I'm just gonna press again later. But if you wanna press, by all means, go right ahead. So I'm just pushing out those corners, checking everything lined up really nicely. And now I'm ready to do the same thing with the lining, but first I'm going to add my handle to the outside. So I have my handle that I completed earlier. And I'm just gonna open this up a little bit, make it a little longer. And first thing I'm gonna do is make sure that the hardware, the slide set, is facing in towards the bag. We wanna put it right sides together. So I'm gonna come right over here and place one edge right on that seam. It's right on the middle seam right there, kind of eyeball it. And then I'm gonna come around here, make sure that this is not twisted, and add the tab on the other side. I get asked a lot if it matters what side the tab is on and what side the handle itself is on, and I have not found that it ever makes any difference. The only thing that I like to do, number one, I make sure that my folded edge is facing towards the front, and number two, my hardware is facing inwards so it's right sides together. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm just going to stitch a few times back and forth, less than 1/4 of an inch. My outside and my lining are now complete, so it's time to put them together and finish up the bag. So again, on the outside, I have my handle sewn in on the sides. I just stitched it less than 1/4 of an inch a few times across just to hold it in place. I find it much easier to do that than to try and add clips when I'm putting it into the lining. I don't want to lose my handle. My flap is basted onto the back of my bag, so that's all ready to go. This is turned right side out. My lining is still turned wrong side out. You want to leave it that way. I've stitched from the top down past the darts on each side, and I've left a very large opening for turning. So now what I'm going to do is put my outside inside the lining. So I'm just going to open this up. And I did my pockets the exact same way, so they're just divided down the center. If you've done them differently and you want one part in the back and one part in the front, whatever you want in the back is going to go towards the back of your bag. For me, it doesn't really matter at all. So I'm just going to set this inside. And I'm going to tuck the flap as well as the handle inside. Just like that. And you can reach in and kind of pull that down. I think my flap is, yep, it's stuck on one of my pockets. There we go. So at this point, I don't want to see the flap or the handle up at the top. I pulled my handle down towards, out of the opening at the lining. And all I'm gonna do is first line up the seam of each side. So the seam on this lining and the seam on the outside. My handle is right there, basted in place, and add a clip. And I'll come over here and do the same thing. Your pieces are the same size, so it always feels like they don't fit. It feels like the lining is too tight because you have so much going on the outside. As long as your pieces were cut and trimmed the same size, you should not have any issues. If you have found that you have really big gaps here, something is much larger than the other, you will want to go in and just, check your measurements. But if you have little tiny gaps where things just aren't lining up perfectly, it's probably just because they're the exact same size. So I'm just kind of working my way around. I lined up my seams because those were important. And the only thing that I am clipping together on the front side is just the top edge of the lining and the top edge of the back. On the sides, I have my handles caught, my seams lined up, and on the back, I have my flap as well as the outside and the lining. So it's a little bit thick back here where your flap is, so make sure that you take your time on that. If you have to switch to a walking foot or try a different foot, that's totally fine. If you have to increase your stitch length, that will also help. The rest of it should not give you any troubles at all. If you have a free arm on your sewing machine, take your table off and use your free arm. I'm going to stitch around this 2 times to make sure I catch everything. And a lot of times with the clips, even though they're helping, they get in my way. So I'm gonna stitch around the first time, try to catch it as best as I can, go around a second time without the clips and even everything out. And then I'll be ready to turn it right side out, press it, and finish it up. I finished stitching all the way around the top edge of my bag. I did stitch twice. I'm not sure, I don't even know what happened here, but a lot of times on my first go around, weird things like that happen because my clips are kind of getting in the way and I'm constantly starting and stopping. On my Janome 15,000, I have the option to have my foot auto pivot and lift every time I stop stitching. When I do this and my final bit of top stitching, I turn that option off. I find that it keeps it anchored a little bit better, and especially for the top stitching, which is the last thing I'm gonna do, I just feel like it helps me a lot. So just a tip for you. So now that I have that done, I'm gonna turn everything through this opening. And I try to, instead of pulling, I'm just kind of like holding the lining and just gently rolling it. It's just a little bit better than pulling. The more you pull, the more likely you are to pop stitches. I think I just took one out of the lining, but that's fine. I don't want to rip anything that, that I really can't fix at this point. So just checking, everything is caught. Got a couple of threads here. Everything looks good. So I'm going to take this over to the iron and give it a good press. I'm going to close up my lining, and very simple, I just roll these edges under. You can do this by hand if you want. I'm going to do it on the machine. That's how I like to do it. It's the very bottom of the lining, so no one's going to see it anyway. If you would prefer to stitch it by hand, go right ahead. I just don't really like to do any hand sewing. I like my whole bag to be made on the machine. So just fold those edges under about 1/4 inch. And there's that little thread that I popped. And I'm just going to stitch probably about 1/8 inch right across there. So once I have that sewn, I'm going to tuck that in, tuck that all the way down. And a lot of times I'll do this where I kind of roll that top edge first and then tuck it inside. And then I'm going to top stitch right around this top edge. I'm probably going to do 1/4, I might do 1/8, I'm not sure. So I'm going to press this, close that up, and then do my top stitching. My bag is all done. I finished up the lining, I closed it, tucked it in, I gave it a really good press, and then I top stitched around the top. I will say, I think the top stitching on this bag is the most challenging part of the bag, or really any bag that has a flap. What happens is on this side, when you're top stitching, your flap is on the bed of your machine, so it moves pretty nicely. And as you start to turn it or try to turn it, this technically needs to be underneath, but it's so big and bulky. So what I do is I stitch my back first, I get over to the front, and then I try to actually pull the flap back so that it's not getting caught underneath the bed of the machine, just to try to make this a little bit easier. But if you're having that much of a hard time with the top stitching because it's awkward, skip it. It's totally fine. It's not a problem. I'm giving you permission. I would rather you skip the top stitching than have a hard time or not like how it looks. And again, I use contrasting thread, even though I didn't think I was going to, and I'm very happy with how it looks, but my top stitching on this top edge is not perfect. I did have a couple of spots where I kind of shifted a little bit. Am I gonna worry about it? No, I'm gonna let it go. It's totally fine. And it's under the flap, so even though it's in the front, it's kind of hidden anyway. So I've got my pocket here, nice big pocket. I've got my 2 pockets right here, lots of pockets inside my flap. I love this. I can just open this up. I actually was carrying this bag for a little while, and what I would keep in the flap was my wallet and, you know, all of the things that I like to grab really quickly, like my chapstick or maybe my car keys. And when I would wear it on my hip, because I like to wear a crossbody, I could just reach this up towards me, open it, grab whatever I needed, and close it right up. So it was really, really convenient. It might seem a little odd. Why would I want a pocket that opens completely flat? But it actually is really, really convenient. And I think for traveling, you know, when we get to start doing that a little bit more, that would be great for a plane. You can keep your tablet, anything that you need close by, and you don't have to worry about, you know, trying to dig around and find it. So my bag is done. I'm super pleased with how this came out. I can't wait to see how your Evie Messenger bags come out. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe and click the little notification bell. I upload every Friday around 1 p.m. our Facebook Live, and I try to upload tutorials like this as often as I can. I'm working my way through my entire pattern collection. So if you have any questions or you want to request any other patterns, leave it in the comments. I'm happy to answer them. You can find all of the items I have here right on my website, and I'll have all of my social media linked. Thanks for joining me.